8. Albert Flick. After serving her husband Albert with divorce papers in 1979, Sandra Flick asked him to pick up his belongings from her home. When he arrived, he stabbed her at least 14 times and left her for dead. A neighbor found Sandra covered in blood and dying in her apartment. With her last breath, she said that Albert was responsible for the horrifying act. Flick received a 30-year prison sentence, but was released 9 years early due to good behavior. But his pattern of violence against women continued, and in 2007, he allegedly punched a woman and stabbed her with a fork. 3 years later, Flick was accused of putting another woman in a headlock, hitting her with the butt of his knife, and chasing her with a screwdriver. Prosecutors recommended an 8 to 9 year sentence, but the judge believed that the aging defendant was getting too old to commit any more violent acts and sentenced him to 4 years. Shortly after his release in 2014, Flick crossed paths with the woman he had assaulted in 2010 and threatened her, landing him back behind bars for another 2 years. After getting out of prison yet again in 2016, he moved to Lewiston, Maine, where he befriended 48-year-old Kimberly Dobby at a local library. Flick could tell that Dobby was struggling and offered to feed her 2 sons. But what started out as a seemingly generous helping hand soon turned into a terrifying stalking campaign. The elderly felon became obsessed with Dobby and began following her relentlessly around town. One day in 2018, a businessman heard a woman screaming from outside a local laundromat. He ran outside to find Flick viciously stabbing Dobby in broad daylight. He did it right in front of her kids. The man tried to intervene, but it was too late to save her life. In 2019, at the age of 77, Flick was convicted of Dobby's murder and sentenced to life. 7. Kenneth McDuff. Kenneth Allen McDuff's life of crime dates back to the 1960s, during his early adulthood. At 18 years old, he was convicted of multiple burglaries in Texas. He served a short prison sentence and was released in 1965. Less than a year later, McDuff and an accomplice, Roy Dale Green, kidnapped 3 teenagers. McDuff shot and killed 2 of the victims, Robert Brand and Mark Dunman, before he and Green repeatedly assaulted the 3rd victim, Edna Louise Sullivan. After the pair were finished with their cruel attacks, McDuff broke her neck with a broomstick and dumped her lifeless body in some bushes. He was originally sentenced to death, but his punishment was commuted to life in prison in 1972, when Texas ended its use of the death penalty for a short period. In 1989, McDuff managed to convince the parole board to release him, despite having recently received an additional 2-year sentence for trying to bribe one of the board members. He allegedly killed someone just 3 days after his release, but was never charged in the case. After briefly returning to prison for a parole violation and once again regaining his freedom in 1991, McDuff tortured and killed 6 prostitutes over a 5-month period. The murders were spread out over several counties, and by the time investigators connected McDuff to the crimes, he had moved to Missouri and was living under an alias. One of his coworkers recognized him from an episode of America's Most Wanted and contacted authorities, who confirmed through fingerprints that they had the right suspect. McDuff was convicted of capital murder and was sentenced to death for the 2nd time. He was executed in 1998. 6. Cody Backus. In 2007, at just 22 years old, Cody Backus was faced with the possible reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Just a year earlier, he was involved in an armed robbery in Syracuse, New York, that resulted in the shooting death of a man named James Brennan Jr. Backus claimed that he wasn't the gunman, but a mere participant in the home invasion gone wrong. He said that he didn't even know one of his accomplices was armed. He was nevertheless convicted of murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. A state Supreme Court judge overturned the conviction in 2014, citing new evidence that corroborated Backus's claim that he was unaware that one of his co-defendants was carrying a gun. But the decision was reversed the following year, and he was sent back to prison. Backus was paroled in 2018. 4 years later, he became the prime suspect in the murder of his neighbor, 82-year-old Marshall Foster, who was found on the floor of his home in critical condition after being attacked by an intruder. Foster reportedly languished for 2 days with a severe brain injury and multiple facial and spinal fractures before he was discovered clinging to life. He was rushed to the hospital where he died from his injuries. Police connected Backus to the assault after he allegedly posted footage of it on social media and continuing to beat the senior citizen after forcing his way inside. Backus faces charges of second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, burglary, and assault, and is currently being held at the Oswego County Jail on a $500,000 bond. 5. David Moust. David Edward Moust was just 9 years old when his mother dumped him off at a mental institution in Pennsylvania. He already had a troubling history of violence by then, which included attacks on other children and killing small animals. Moust joined the Army when he reached adulthood and was stationed in Germany during the early 1970s. During his time overseas, he was convicted of manslaughter for killing a teenager and served 3 years out of a 4-year prison sentence. In 1979, after moving back to the US, Moust was accused of attempted murder for stabbing a friend while they slept. He was not found guilty, although evidence would later reveal that he had committed the crime. 2 years later, he drowned a young man named Donald Jones in Illinois. He then went to Texas and stabbed another young man, who survived with serious injuries. While in prison for the stabbing, Moust was extradited to Illinois to face a murder charge for Jones's death. He was found unfit to stand trial and spent the next 12 years in mental health facilities and jail. When Moust finally pleaded guilty in 1994, he received credit for time served, significantly reducing the length of his 35-year sentence, which he only served a few more years of before being released in 1999. The prosecutor fought to keep Moust incarcerated, and Moust himself even wrote to the Illinois Department of Corrections telling them that they shouldn't release him. But the warnings fell on deaf ears, and he was turned back out onto the streets. He proved he couldn't control his violent urges in 2001 when he repeatedly hit someone in the back of the head with a metal pipe. The victim survived and declined to press charges. In 2003, the body of a missing teenager named James Ragagni was found encased in cement on Moust's property. The young man had been strangled to death. Moust was charged with the murder of Ragagni and 2 other teens who were found murdered and disposed of in a similar fashion. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 life terms, but took his own life in early 2006. Inside his cell, prison employees found a note confessing to 5 murders and apologizing to the victims' families. 4. Malcolm Benson. When Malcolm Benson was convicted of second-degree murder and felony gun charges in 1995, Michigan had a generous disciplinary credit system in place that allowed convicts to significantly reduce lengthy sentences for serious crimes based on good behavior. The state strengthened its sentencing guidelines in 1998, but the new policy apparently wasn't retroactive. Consequently, Benson was released in 2015 after not even serving the minimum of his 20 to 40-year sentence. Just 9 months later, he fatally shot a 59-year-old Army veteran named Stanley Carter at a bus station during a botched robbery. Witnesses told investigators that there was no type of altercation or argument leading up to the shooting, but that Benson approached seemingly out of nowhere and opened fire. He was also accused of assaulting a woman near the crime scene. If the state's current sentencing guidelines had applied to Benson's first murder case, he would have been required to serve at least 22 years of his sentence, and he would have definitely still been in prison when Carter was killed. A judge sentenced him to life for Carter's murder, and this time he won't be getting any breaks. He'll spend the rest of his days behind bars, where he can no longer harm anyone in the free world. 3. Edward ONeill. In 2016, a teenager named Ryan Roberts was found stabbed to death in a wooded area in southeast Houston, Texas. Authorities charged his best friend, 18-year-old Edward ONeill IV, with the young man's murder. ONeill, who had a history of mental health issues and a reputation as a Satan worshiper, was held in the Harris County Jail for 4 years before the judge overseeing the case reduced his bail. He posted bond while the case remained at a standstill due to his mental competency. Just a few months later, ONeill became the prime suspect in the murder of his cousin's ex-boyfriend, 39-year-old Derek Mike, who was shot to death in a parking lot in late 2020. According to records obtained by the Houston Chronicle, ONeill confessed to the crime to his mother, who reportedly told police that she was afraid of what else her son might do. She also claimed that her son became fixated on the devil at an early age and had a history of killing family pets. ONeill maintained his innocence in court regarding Ryan Roberts' murder in 2016. After being charged in connection with the 2020 murder, he allegedly claimed that he killed Derek Mike at his cousin's urging after she found out that the victim had cheated on her. There have been no updates on either case since news sources reported on the additional murder charge in 2020. Records indicate that there are no inmates by the name of Edward ONeill in Harris County or the state prison system, suggesting that perhaps his cases are still delayed due to his mental health. 2. Eric Pearson. In 1985, Eric Pearson broke into a woman's home in Florida and cut her throat. She survived, and he served just 4 years of an 18-year sentence. Pearson committed his first murder at the age of 28 in 1993, when he beat and strangled 17-year-old Christina Whitaker to death in Davie, Florida. He was released from prison in 2020 after serving 27 years of a 40-year sentence. Barely a year later, Pearson found himself at the center of an investigation into a missing 33-year-old single mom named Erica Verdesia. A witness recalled seeing Erica at a sandwich shop with a grimy man matching Pearson's description shortly before her disappearance. Around the same time, the two were seen together during a traffic stop. Pearson initially told police that he and Erica had parted ways at a gas station, but surveillance footage showed the pair stopping at the store before the traffic stop, which proved that he was lying. 3 weeks after Erica went missing, her remains were found in a canal near Pearson's girlfriend's house. The girlfriend told police that Pearson had recently made some disturbing comments while staring at the canal, including that without a body, the police had no case. Erica's mother, Carmen, believes that Pearson received too many second chances as a convicted violent criminal, and that he shouldn't have been free to kill her daughter. She helped push for a new state law that requires convicts to serve 85% of their sentences. In the meantime, Pearson is being held without bond on a first-degree murder charge. 1. Stanley Tarrant. In June of 1993, Stanley Tarrant stabbed family friend Jackie Harris to death during an argument at his mother's Webster, Florida home. He was only 15 years old at the time, but he was tried as an adult due to the severity of the crime. As part of a plea deal, he copped to second-degree murder in exchange for a 51-year sentence. He won a resentencing hearing in 2016 under Florida's newly imposed sentencing guidelines, which require courts to reconsider the punishments of prisoners who received de facto life sentences as juveniles. As a result, Tarrant was released for good behavior in 2018, 22 years into his sentence. Less than 6 months later, he was implicated in the murder of 40-year-old Fanny Houck, who was shot execution-style in the back of the head and left on the roadside in Sumter County. Detectives told Leesburg Daily Commercial that they received leads indicating that Tarrant and Hook were seen leaving Tampa together shortly before her body was found. Cell phone data confirmed that Hoke was within a half-mile of Tarrant's residence several hours after they were spotted in Tampa, and investigators recovered the alleged murder weapon during a search of Tarrant's vehicle. Authorities declined to elaborate on a possible motive or the suspected nature of the relationship between Tarrant and Hoke, but said that they did not believe the victim was with the suspect against her will. And while the case went quiet in the news, prison records show that Tarrant was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder and robbery with a deadly weapon in 2022. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to a paroled killer who minds their own business and seems to be on the straight and narrow, or next to a habitual thief with dozens of non-violent convictions under their belt and no apparent desire to turn their life around? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.